Office. I wanted to thank you guys for being here today. As we round out the first half of the year, we want to take an opportunity to touch on some of our mid-year statistics, and we have several speakers lined up for that. Before I pass it over to Chief Jennings, I just want to take a moment and provide a quick snapshot of some of these statistics that we have for you guys today. The first half of 2021, we have seen an overall decrease in crime of 6% compared to last year at this time. Property crime has dropped by 8.5%. This includes 236 fewer homes that have been broken into during this same time. Business burglaries are also down 26%, and larcenies have dropped by 8%. While it's been successful in some areas, we have seen challenges and difficulties in the first half of 2021. Car break-ins have gone up 5%, and auto thefts have also subsequently gone up 10.5%. During the course of these vehicle break-ins, 554 firearms have been stolen from cars. I want to repeat that number again. 554 firearms have been stolen during vehicle break-ins just in the first half of 2021, which is a 66% increase from the previous year. During the first half of the year, rapes have also gone up 42%. Aggravated assaults have increased 13%. At this time, I'd like to invite Chief Jennings to come over and speak.
All right, thank you. I appreciate everyone being here. It's kind of hard to believe that it was just about a year ago that I was being introduced as the next police chief or as the police chief in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. It's certainly been an honor to be able to serve in such a fine institution over the past year. I'm very humbled by the fact of the work that you see with our officers and the things that they have been able to accomplish, even through a pandemic and some of the uprisings that we saw last year. But there's been some great work that we're going to highlight today, and some things that you're going to hear about that might shock you and that might be of interest to the public to be able to know some of these things that we're going to talk about. So it's also look at just a few weeks ago, as everyone knows, you heard the announcement that Deputy Chief Estella Patterson is going to be the next police chief for the Raleigh Police Department. Chief Patterson is a good friend of mine, also has been a peer here and a great leader within the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. I'm certainly proud of her announcement to be the next chief. She's well deserving. Raleigh has certainly made an excellent decision in their next leader for their police department. So as we transition into the quarterly update, I think these are important because we're able to look back at some of the things and measures of not just CMPD, but within our community, some of the things that we've been dealing with and some of the dealing with safety of our citizens and how we're looking at protection and serving our public. So we also look at the numbers on ways that we can improve, on things that we can do better with the ultimate goal of keeping our citizens and our public safe and making sure we accomplish those the best way that we know how. You know, as we look at halfway through the year, we've seen throughout our community, it seems like it's been such a long road already at this point, but also it's the same breath, it seems like it's happened so quickly that here we are already at July. I'm going to talk about, and you heard some of the numbers already, and you're going to hear more numbers, but as we talk about the numbers, you also have to understand that these are real people, real victims, people, their families their brothers, their sons, daughters, when we look at that. So the best way to be able to talk about it is through the numbers. However, we also have to realize that there are human beings behind each of these. You know, it's a mother that lost her son because of a senseless act of violence within our community. You know, it's a father who has to go to work every day with the nightmare and memory of having to stare down a barrel as a victim of a robbery. It's that young child who sits in their house that has to lay on the floor dodging bullets as gunfire shoots through their residence, not just once but multiple times. So those are the kind of things that bring the human side of the numbers to light. So this is why we work so hard. This is why you see CMPD and our officers that are dedicated to solve crime through investigations, through proactive work that we try to avoid the crime happening in the first place. I'm very proud to be the leader of such an organization of where we have officers committed to the safety of our public. And we're going to share a couple of those accomplishments here shortly. So it's encouraging that we've seen a drop, as you heard, in the property crime. But there is a component to that property crime that I think needs to be highlighted and people need to be made aware of. You know, as a community, I think we all need to do a better job and the responsibility of securing firearms. What we're seeing is firearms that are stolen are generally used in the commission of a crime. So when those firearms are stolen out of someone's vehicle, out of someone's home, we're seeing those firearms back on the streets being used in the commission of a crime. Now, this number is startling to me that you look at 2,139 community members, citizens within Charlotte, so far this year, halfway through the year, have been assaulted with a firearm. And 466 community members have been robbed with the use of a weapon. Now, as I said, we talk about the numbers. Those are real people that we're talking about here. That's an astonishing number when you look at it. You know, many of them didn't suffer that much harm, so it's probably things that a lot of people haven't heard about. It doesn't go along with other cases where you hear about them resulting in homicides or things like that, but these are things that are kind of lost in the numbers when we look at it. And none of that's acceptable. You know, although we do what we can and we see crime has dropped and we're being successful so far this year, but we have to be able to be at a point to where none of this is acceptable, and we take every opportunity to make sure we address the violent crime as we see it. So to that end, I do want to share some of the tremendous work of our employees. For the first half of the year, our communications division has answered more than 457,000 calls to 911 and more than 1,200 texts to 911. Our officers have addressed more than 250,000 calls for service so far this year. We've seized 1,481 illegal guns as evidence, and 1,530 of the 6,750 arrests that we've made have been for violent crime. This work is great with both the excellent work by both our sworn and civilian staff, and some of the work that's resulted in the arrest of 48 homicide suspects, 21 rape suspects, 328 robbery suspects, and more than 1,100 suspects in aggravated assault. Again, I'm extremely proud of the work that our officers have done to be able to accomplish some of this, and because of that, there are some great units we're going to highlight here that have been behind some of that we've been able to focus and be intentional about some of these efforts. One thing I haven't mentioned was the armed robberies that are down almost 22% this year. There's no doubt that a portion of this is the reason of the hard work of the armed robbery unit and its supervisor, Sergeant Brian Scharf. I'm going to have Sergeant Scharf come up and talk about his work that he's been doing for more than 11 years. It's astonishing. He doesn't look that old, but he really is. So, Sergeant Scharf.
Good morning. Like Chief said, I've been supervising the armed robbery unit for 11 plus years, and I agree with him, it shows. Through those years, I've been humbled, and I'm very proud of the work ethic, the tenacity, and the dedication of our detectives. To give you some perspective, the national clearance rate average for armed robbery cases is around 30%. Considering the difficulties in solving these types of crimes, that's a respectable number. The detectives in our armed robbery unit clear, on average, about 60%, and have done so consistently for the last 6 years. You know, a lot goes into these investigations, and a huge reason they are successful is just simply good investigative work, good initial police work, and in many cases, assistance from the community. An example of their dedication just came to fruition last week, a really good example with their partnership with the FBI's Violent Crime Task Force. In the second half of 2019 through February of 2020, detectives with the Armed Robbery Unit and the FBI's Violent Crime Task Force began investigating a string of armed robberies that were, to some degree, clearly committed by the same individual and were all the same business type. Detectives sifted through dozens of cases to determine which ones were related and which ones were not. They combed through hours of surveillance and large amounts of evidence related to these cases. Their hard work paid off when they were able to identify Ron Garland and Chan Tate as the suspects responsible for this series of armed business robberies. That was back in February of 2020. Our armed robbery detectives with the FBI's Violent Crime Task Force then began working with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Charlotte, who just last week tried this case against Mr. Garland, who posed, and the reason they tried this particular case is the danger that he posed to the community and his extensive criminal history. Garland was tried by a jury in federal court and was convicted on several armed robbery-related charges and could face up to a maximum of 30 years in prison. Those are the types of sentences that we work with the FBI and this task force. Tate, his co-defendant, had previously pled guilty to his armed robbery-related charges and is also awaiting sentencing. But again, that's just one example, and it's not unique to their work. We do this all the time. They do this all the time. And in the past year, 11 other suspects have been convicted, sentenced to prison time ranging from 6 to 24 years with an average of 12 years. 17 suspects have pled guilty and are awaiting sentencing. 15 additional suspects have been indicted and are awaiting trial. These 40 individuals now in the federal system are likely responsible for hundreds of business and persons robberies in our city. Removing them from the streets has sent a clear and very, very strong message and has played a tremendous role in the overall 22% reduction of armed robbery cases in our community. Now, our unit specifically handles business robberies, both armed and common law robberies or serial robberies that focus on the registers, cash, the safe, things like that. We have seen an incredible 60% reduction in cases. Again, just business robberies focused on cash. If it had not been for the detectives' diligent work and our invaluable partnership with the FBI's Violent Crime Task Force and the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Charlotte, I have no doubt, and I'm confident in saying that robberies would be much more rampant today than they are. And I'll leave you with this. Please remember that each one of these robberies, there was an employee. This wasn't just the money being taken from the business. An employee was traumatized, an employee was victimized, an employee who's just working to pay his bills, maybe feed his family, maybe pay for school, make their car payment. You know, these are people, and these are people that come from all walks of life working in these businesses. And it's a traumatic experience, and it's one they will never forget. And frankly, it's the reason why the detectives and police officers, all of our detectives, not just the detectives of our unit, and all of our police officers, all of our leaders work so hard to bring justice then, now, and always. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarge. Earlier this year at our previous press briefing, we talked about how we combined several of our units into one in response to the rise in gun crime, and that is the crime gun suppression unit. And so what I'd like to do at this time is invite Sergeant Myers up here to speak about his team and the success that unit has had and positively affected the community we serve. Sergeant Myers.
Good morning. My name is Daniel Myers. I'm one of the sergeants over the crime gun suppression team, as was stated. As Chief Jennings pointed out, there have been more than 2,100 people who have been assaulted with firearms this year. 479 residents, with victims ranging from infants to the elderly, have had gunfire blindly enter their homes, send glass, wood, and brick flying into their bedrooms and living spaces. Some have unfortunately been hit by this gunfire, but all these victims relive these horrific experiences each day. At the end of March, as was stated, we announced the merger of CMPD's gang unit, trap unit, which is what I was a sergeant over, and our SIOP task force, and formed the crime gun suppression team. Our mission is to employ intelligence-based strategies to interrupt gun-based crime trends and prevent future gun violence. One of the biggest factors to preventing gun-based violence is to focus on violent offenders who repeatedly commit gun-related crime in the city. That's where my team comes in. On my team, other than the sergeants, we have 12 detectives whose experience and work ethic is top-notch. A good example of a case that we've recently worked end of last week, we had an individual we identified who had a very extensive violent history, repeat offender within Charlotte, somebody that my detectives were aware of, put forth a great deal of effort into trying to locate him. He had an outstanding order for his arrest for a violent crime, put forth a tremendous amount of man hours in both covert and overt operations. We're able to track down this individual utilizing our K-9 unit, helicopter unit. We were able to move in successfully and tactically, and we're able to take this individual as well as another into custody. This person who was placed under arrest had 2 firearms on him, one of which was reported stolen. It was fantastic work by these detectives to be so successful and be safe while doing so. This case is not unique. I've been able to watch the men and women, this newly formed unit, use their incredible expertise and work ethic to turn over a large number of cases with impressive results. So far this year, these detectives have made 89 arrests and have seized 67 illegal firearms, 11 of which have been reported stolen. Their success comes from a variety of close work with our intel unit, our crime lab, our DA's office, crime analysis, which is instrumental in helping us out, and partnerships with both state and federal agencies. It is because of this teamwork and ability to work together that we have been so successful in bringing violent offenders off the streets and into custody. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergeant Myers. As we begin to close, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about our Crime Stoppers program and the hard work that Detective Adrian Johnson is doing. The sooner we have the information, the sooner we can start continuing the investigation, and we've seen that play out in cases today that we've talked about. In the first half of 2021, 1,800 people have reached out to Crime Stoppers with information. That information has led to 185 cases being cleared, 248 charges, and 53 illegal weapons being seized off the streets of Charlotte. That's more than $14,000 in rewards that have been approved as far from those tips. So I want to just remind everybody that if the community has any information they want to provide, they can call 704-334-1600. That information is anonymous. They can also use the P3 Tips app to provide that information. I know we provide you guys with a lot of numbers today, a lot of stats, and we're going to be providing you with some more of those hard numbers via email following our presser today. At this time, I'd like to open up the questions for any of our speakers today, if there are any questions.
Is there an update that you can give us on the homicide that happened at the Circle K along Harris Station Boulevard?
Yeah, that's still an active investigation, and at this point, we provided all the information that's available. Our detectives are continuing to work that investigation. I believe last night we provided the victim's name, and we're still working through leads on that case. We just encourage anybody that has any information to call 911 or to utilize Crime Stoppers.
Now, overall, the department says that crime is down by 6%, but neighbors, particularly in that area, feel that, that's not the truth. They feel that violence in that area is going up. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, we understand those concerns, and, we understand what they're going through. The numbers we provided today are a snapshot of what's going on. That's the city of Charlotte. We have community coordinators in those divisions that work with those people one-on-one. And so we know the work's not done. The work's going to continue, and we're committed to that. So we encourage them to reach out to us with their concerns so that we can have those face-to-face and help them address those concerns in that manner.
So you are seeing an increase in crime, particularly in that area?
I can't speak to that area. I'd have to get back on those stats. So if you want to follow us off the air, I'd be happy to look into that for you.
Tom, can I get Chief
Yes,
Jennings up
yep.
here for sort of a bigger picture, sort of context? Get the big dog.
I knew you would ask
I
for
know.
it, Mark. So,
That's why they
yes.
keep me around. Chief, you talked about these are not just numbers, these are
Yeah.
real people, right? I mean, and as you said, we've been inundated sort of with numbers, but what's your gut sense as to where we are right now? Are we better than we were a year ago when you stepped up and took this position, and where do we need to go?
It's interesting because when we look at numbers and we start saying, well, let's compare it to what we saw last year at the same time. Last year was an anomaly, and last year it's kind of difficult to say, what we saw in the beginning of 2020 and all through 2020, were things that we have never experienced before as a society, much less as a police department. So what I'm more interested in also is we also look at averages, 5-year averages, but also I want to look at what happened in 2019 as compared to what we're seeing here in 2021. If you remember 2020, at this point, we were seeing some very significant numbers that were very concerning, particularly with the violent crime and the rate of increase in violent crime. So as we talk about numbers being down, I don't think it's time to celebrate that. I think it's time to look at how do we continue that downward trend, and we're going to continue to do that.
You talked a lot about.
Which
No,
one?
sorry, just
Yeah.
to follow up quickly
Yes.
on the gun, the crime gun suppression team.
Yes.
This is something new, and we were looking at, these shootings into occupied dwellings. I mean, we
Yes.
just got people asleep in bed, and boom, 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 and
Yes.
the bullets come in. Obviously, an ongoing concerns, and some of the numbers we talked about, 479 residents
Yes.
being hit. This is a new approach, and how is it working? What would you like to see it do?
Yeah, so you talk about shooting in occupied dwellings. Those are very reckless, senseless acts that have absolutely no regard to the sanctity of human life. When we start seeing people randomly shooting into a residence, they don't know who they're targeting or who might be in that house. It could be a kid that is struck with one of their bullets, and that's concerning to us because it's much different than someone getting into an argument with an individual, and that argument escalates into a homicide. When you have someone shooting into a residence who may have several people in there, and I think that's such a reckless act that we have to do something. So what we did last year was we had units that had different responsibilities, but were kind of doing the same task. We had a lot of great talent in each of those units that we felt like that if we were able to merge them in together and use that talent, that we would have a bigger resource to be able to address not just shooting in occupied dwelling, but guns, crime guns in general, because it's so significant in our city now that if we're not addressing not just the investigation of those crimes, but also what's leading up to that point and trying to stop them from occurring in the first place, then we're not being responsible as a police department. And I think we've been able to accomplish that. I'm very happy with the work that they do. They report to us regularly on the successes they've had. Many of the successes are things that are not tangible. So when we are able to thwart violence from happening, that's something that's not always going to make it to the headlines because it never occurred. So I'm very pleased with the work that they've done.
You talked a lot about stolen firearms. How are people getting their hands on these guns, and what is your message to legal gun owners about securing their firearms?
Yes, absolutely. So a lot of what we've seen is car break-ins that people leave their firearms unsecured in their vehicles, and that's concerning as well. But we've had also house break-ins where people have their guns in obvious places where a thief will go and look, and they'll take their guns. A lot of thieves are targeting specific vehicles because they feel, say for example, a truck. They feel that there's likelihood of a gun being in those trucks. We see car break-ins where people don't take anything because they're looking for the guns. But there are devices out there that you can secure guns to areas within your car that even if they are located, they can't be taken. And we encourage gun owners to utilize all of those techniques. If you have a dash that you can lock them in when you're out of your vehicle, and also encourage them not to leave their guns in their vehicles overnight, because if you're parked in the driveway and you have your gun in your vehicle, then the likelihood of someone breaking into your vehicle and finding that gun are very high. So there are measures that can be taken. It's not going to stop every incident, but I think it can reduce them dramatically.
Sexual assaults, that seems to be the highest increase statistic on this graphic here. Is there any reason why we're seeing the increase in sexual assaults?
I wish I had the reason because I could go after that reason. So it's very difficult when you start looking at a lot of sexual assaults that we do get, however, are things that might have occurred in the past and that are just now being reported. And A lot of it also involves people that are known to one another. And so if there's anything encouraging about that, I think the investigations into those are pretty much dependent on information that we know, and we're not looking at strangers that are going around assaulting individuals. That does happen, but I think for the most part, most of those suspects are known to the victim.
What would you say your message is to people out there looking to start trouble, out there doing these random acts of violence, shooting into homes and cars, out here shooting people at gas stations? What is your message?
Well, and that's a great question, because what I see with particularly our young people is you have it seems like it's becoming regular incidents now where there's a 15, 16-year-old that's shot and killed laying in the middle of the street, and then a 15, 16-year-old is the one who pulled the trigger. Think about, it's tragic enough that you lose the life of that young man or young woman, but it's also it compiles the tragedy when you look at the life of the suspect who's lost also. I think we don't need to lose track of where we have failed as a society with that individual that has escalated something to the point to where they're going to take a life and then ruin their own life, because now they have to be accountable for that. So my message is that we as a society, we need to be able to find these individuals who are on that path and provide opportunities and resources for them so that we can break that cycle, that they're not going into that path in the first place. And then for the ones who do that, they need to stop and think sometimes. You know, when things get out of hand and there's violence that's starting to escalate, we need to take a step back as human beings and think about what the cost is that they're looking at this point. So it's very difficult to do that, but just the amount of the temperatures or the tempers that flare during these arguments, and it causes people not to really think about what their actions are. And if they take a step back, maybe they'll give that some thought. Yes, sir.
I thought something interesting was the officer complaints. I saw 46 internal compared to 25 external.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that? And,
Yes. So our officer internal complaints versus external complaints historically have always been higher, and oftentimes you've seen at points where we basically are reporting ourselves 3 times more than the public does, and that often happens. But these numbers are not surprising, because I do feel like that our officers hold each other accountable, and that when they see an officer that has violated policy or stepped out of line, it's not unusual for them to report that incident and to begin that investigation internally. So I'm very proud to say that we do that, and also say that we know that we're not perfect in this world, but officers are very deliberate about not allowing someone else to tarnish that badge, because we know the effect that it has on our profession. We know the effect that it has on their jobs and their satisfaction at work and their morale. So they want to get rid of the bad apples, so to speak, just as much as the public does. So they're recognizing that. So that number has been like that for many years that I can remember. And again, I'm very proud of our agency to be able to say that when they see things that are outside of our policy, they want that to be addressed.
Chief, my last question, are you optimistic going forward? We're halfway through this year. What can we turn around? Are you overall crimes down, but the violent stuff is the stuff that sadly is...
Yeah, I mean, how can you not be optimistic at this point from what we faced last year? So, yeah, I'm very optimistic. I think that we're starting to see some normalcy come back to society. I think that we're starting to see our officers much more comfortable in dealing with some of the issues and crime that we're seeing. I think we're working well with the community to be able to address and tailor responses from the department. And so as we continue to see that work and continue to see that our officers are accepting of that work as well as the community accepting of our officers, I think we're going to see some great progress, and I'm looking forward to it. So yeah, I'm very optimistic at this point.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you again, everyone. And like we said, we'll be sending you guys some more detailed information shortly. So have a great day. You want to send me an email?